I'm Nate Eaton, and this is True Crime Rocket Science.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In less than 2 weeks, the other half, and arguably the better half, of the Doomsday cult couple stands trial for the murder of his wife Tammy and the murders of his second wife's 2 children. It's taken almost 5 long years to get to this point. Laurie, you may remember, was convicted of the same charges last year, and she's on trial for a 4th murder, that of Charles Vallow, in an Arizona court starting on April 4th. That should be an interesting juxtaposition for anyone paying any attention to this case. Laurie and Chad both on trial for murder, both on trial for murdering their spouses, just not in the same courtroom. Also, Chad's trial will be televised, and so we'll be covering it live on this channel. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, like Alec Baldwin in the Rust case and Kent Mawhinney in the Troconis case, Chad's lawyer stands a better chance, in a sense, to argue against a prosecution that has already played many of its cards. You may remember that Chad's lawyer, John Pryor, as sort of, I think he's asked to be relieved from duty essentially because Chad had run out of money, and the judge, to his credit, wouldn't allow that. That would just have delayed everything. But certainly on paper, it may look like Chad is the lesser of the 2 evils. And I personally believe Laurie's manipulative and narcissistic personality led the couple astray, kind of led both of them astray. But that's not to say if Laurie is guilty that Chad isn't and should be let off the hook. The same kind of argument, if Hannah Gutierrez-Reed is guilty, that doesn't mean no one else is. As we've just seen in the Troconis trial, conspiracy to commit murder is really the same evil intention spread amongst different people. And it's that intention that is a problem in the criminal sense. And even if one doesn't get one's hands dirty in a triple murder, that's no excuse for wanting someone dead and taking some actions and having certain conversations at an advanced level in order to profit from their deaths and then lying about it afterwards. Now, the irony is that Laurie was more like Michelle Troconis in the sense that Laurie probably didn't commit any of the crimes directly, yet had a very direct hand in the planning and cover-up. Someone else did her dirty work for her. In my book, getting someone else to commit murder for you and thus ruining their lives is worse than actually committing the crime. It shows a criminal has become a master, not only governing their own criminal intentions, but persuading someone else off the straight and narrow as well. In this analysis, we want to look at 3 aggravating factors that count against Chad Daybell. Number 1, all 3 bodies were found on Chad's property. Both Laurie's children in the garden around the house, and Tammy apparently died in the bed she shared with Chad. Think about that. 3 bodies on 1 property. Have you ever heard of a case where that is the case? And I'm talking about on someone's private personal property. Number 2, unlike Laurie, who terminated the lives of 2 of her 3 children, and when I say that, she seemed to give the order, if not had a hand in that directly. Well, Chad is accused of participating in a double murder, at the least, when he was the father to 5 children. To give you an idea of how Chad's mind was working at the time, he sent this text to his soon-to-be dead wife shortly after Tylee Ryan, Laurie's daughter, disappeared. And you may remember that her remains were ultimately found on Chad's property, and it eventually they put all the remains together and it came together in like a green bucket. This is what he texted. Well, I've had an interesting morning. I felt I should burn all of the limb debris by the fire pit before it got too soaked by the coming storms. That's what Chad Abel wrote his then wife Tammy at 11:53 a.m. on September 9, 2019. He also texted, while I did so, I spotted a big raccoon along the fence. I hurried and got my gun and he was still walking along. I got close enough that one shot did the trick. He is now in our pet cemetery. Fun times, ! And that does seem to suggest that is how Tylee came to her end, was that she was shot a single time. And we do know that she's buried in the pet cemetery. Then number 3, Chad apparently developed a calculation or an algorithm that showed when a person had become a zombie and were thus disposable. This and his books indicate a meticulous effort to gain power in a particularly sad and sadistic way. Some of you may remember that I attended about 2 weeks of the trial of Lori Vallow. It was my first time in an American courtroom, and it was a memorable experience. I also met some of the local media.
Hey everyone, I'm Chanley Painter with Court TV, and I've been talking to True Crime Rocket Science.
I'm Angela Kerndl, and this is True Crime Rocket Science.
I made eye contact with Lori a few times, and besides observing her, I was literally 1 or 2 meters away. She seemed to think the whole court thing was a joke from start to finish. It was very interesting when court had adjourned for the weekend to explore the fabric of these people's lives. I went to Chad's home in Rexburg. I drove to the Great White Church, like a crown of thorns perched over the town. I remember at the time, because the Lori Vallow trial wasn't televised, very few people seemed to be interested in my coverage. I found it quite disappointing and quite discouraging. Maybe it had something to do with me not being from around here, me not being STA, something like that. Instead, a lot of people, including from my own community, were watching the trial of Gannon Stork. I've written a book about that case, and while it's a heart-wrenching case and it really touched me profoundly as well, the scale of destruction in the Vallow case is so much worse. Not 1 but 2 children murdered, 2 spouses murdered, and a conspiracy involving a brother and sister duo and possibly a third. There were also other attempted murders on other individuals. The part I find terrifying about this case, beyond the sense of a bored lack of interest, it was almost like, oh, so that trial's not televised, not interested in it at all. I found that quite scary in and of itself. But beyond that, it is how a particularly sticky, self-reinforcing psychology can turn an ordinary person into a madman or madwoman. And I get that it's quite a subtle thing. We're dealing with quite cerebral levels of true crime, and it seems like people aren't really interested in that. It's too subtle, I guess. Let me ask you a question. Do you know anyone who has patently irrational beliefs? Do you feel kind of helpless to do anything about them? Do you have a family member who's got very strange beliefs? Well, that's the story I wanted to tell, but it also seems to be a story no one wants to really hear about or talk about. Because in that respect, it can actually happen to any or all of us. You can have a partner that suddenly goes off track. You can have a child that goes off track, or a friend, or yourself. For a sticky belief not based on reality to take over our lives and our ability to see reality, that is really is quite scary. And what does one do to deal with that? How do you defend yourself against a sticky belief that's like a virus that takes over the ability to think rationally and to think realistically? When Lori was sentenced and chose to stand up and speak in her own defense, she stood up, and one wondered whether at last she was about to see the light.
I would like to start by quoting John from the New Testament in the Bible. In John chapter 8, verse 7, Jesus says, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." Then in verse 15, Jesus says, "Ye judge after the flesh, I judge no man. And yet if I judge, my judgment is true." Jesus knows me, and Jesus understands me. I mourn with all of you who mourn, my children and Tammy. Jesus Christ knows the truth of what happened here.
The terror for me is once someone has been exposed to some of these belief systems, they apparently are never the same again. They are, even though they're alive, they are kind of lost. And they end up, from a particular perspective, leading a kind of lost life, a lost existence. You may notice the reluctance of many of the people associated with this case to testify. The same denial that drove Chad and Laurie to go to Hawaii in the midst of the investigation afflicts many others. But how does it happen? I'm not going to take it further than that. I will see you guys again in early April for the commencement of both these trials. Thank you for listening. Take care, stay authentic, and I'll see you guys next time.